sponsors of this series, Lawyers' Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Vancouver Public Library, and the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group. We want to thank you for being here this evening, and thank our special guest who's here with us this evening for traveling up to be with us for this opportunity to speak here this evening. He's traveled a long ways to do this. Professor Robert Williams Jr. is from the Lumbee Tribe in the U.S. He is currently the E. Thomas Sullivan Professor of Law and American Indian Studies Chair, and he's, as I say, from the University of Arizona. He's a graduate of the Harvard Law School, is also a member of the Massachusetts Bar. He's also the faculty chair for the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. And Rob has also served as a judge for the Hul'qumi'num Nation, and he's had an opportunity to write a number of books: The American Indian in Western Legal Thought, the Discovery of Conquest. When you forget your glasses, it's not good. And when you don't have good handwriting, it makes it even worse. Linking Arms Together, the American Indian Vision of Law and Peace. Like a Loaded Weapon, the Rehnquist Court, Indian Rights and the Legal History of Racism in America. Cases and materials on federal Indian law. And then lastly, the title of the book that's here, Savage Anxieties, The Invention of Western Civilization. Rob has had numerous awards for his work in human rights and international law dealing with Indigenous peoples. Rob is currently the counsel for the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group in our case before the Inter-American Commission, which I think he'll share a few thoughts with us on that this evening, as well as having represented other Indigenous peoples in cases before international bodies. His wife, Joy, is also a lawyer. She works in the Public Defender's Department in Tucson, and he has 2 children. And so Rob is a great friend. We've become very good friends. I appreciate him and his willingness to give of his time to our communities, and to give of his time to try and advance the work of Indigenous peoples. So please join me in welcoming Robert Williams.
Sponsors, Lawyers' Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Vancouver Public Library, and the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group for inviting me tonight to speak here. The talk that I want to give tonight is based on my latest book, as Robert said, Savage Anxieties, The Invention of Western Civilization. I tried to carry a box over the border citing the Jay Treaty, but Revenue Canada stopped me, so just kidding. Actually, you can buy it discounted on Amazon.com, so if you like what I have to say, I would encourage you to read the book. I actually do devote the last chapter to a discussion of the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group case and try to contextualize the discussion I'm going to give tonight in a Canadian context as well as other contexts. So the title, sort of riffing on my book, Savage Anxieties, Indigenous Peoples' Human Rights in the Not-So-Special Case of Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group versus Canada, before the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. The reason I call it the not-so-special case is that the situation and the history that I'm going to outline for you tonight is confronted by every First Nation in British Columbia. It's just that the Hul'qumi'num decided to do something about it and go before the international human rights process to challenge that particular situation that they confront. Quite frankly, and it's not me saying this, we were actually able to get a ruling from the first international human rights body to take a look at the British Columbia Treaty Commission process and Canada's comprehensive claims process. We were able to get that body to take a look and find, in fact, that Canada's approach to recognizing and protecting Aboriginal title and rights is deficient under principles of international human rights law. So by the end of my talk, we'll get to a point where you understand why that's so. I begin the book with a quote, and I actually end the book with the same quote from my teacher and mentor, the preeminent United States American Indian scholar and political activist Vine Deloria. Some of you may have read his books back in the 60s. Custer Died for Your Sins, We Talk, You Listen. He was publishing articles in Playboy when you really did read Playboy for the articles, and a really prominent figure. And Vine, toward the end of his life, wrote this amazing essay called Trickster and Messiah, and again, echoing the comments of our opening speaker. What Vine was trying to do was analyze the deep psychosis of Western civilization by using Jungian psychology about archetypes and symbols. And what he says in that book is that the burning question that should occupy our time should concern where the complex of ideas that constitute Western civilization originated, how they originated, and whether they have any realistic correspondence to what we can observe and experience in nature. The complex of ideas that I want to investigate tonight involve the European doctrine of discovery. For example, when Columbus leaves Spain in 3 ships and washes up on the shores of the Bahamas and finds some Arawak Indians and assumes that he can plant the standard of the Spanish crown and claim all those lands to the horizon for Spain, he did so under the doctrine of discovery. When John Cabot sailed from England and coasted down the coast of North America, he claimed all those lands for England under the doctrine of discovery. When the French explorers sailed down the Great Lakes, they claimed all those lands under the doctrine of discovery. Spain, Portugal, Holland, all of the major European colonizing nations utilized this complex of ideas called the doctrine of discovery. And the argument and the thesis in my book is that without the doctrine of discovery, Western civilization, as we know it, would not exist. If you look at the first charter of Virginia, which established the first permanent colony in North America based on England's rights under Cabot's discoveries, you can see this doctrine recited, and you can see the rationale for this idea that when Europeans came upon lands occupied by infidels, heathens, and savages, those peoples who did not have the same standard of civilization as Europeans, those peoples who did not share the same Christian religion, Europeans assumed they had no rights. They were not fully human. And they embodied this racist principle in their own laws and in their charters establishing their colonies throughout the world. So if you look at the Jamestown Charter issued by King James, the same guy who did the Bible, it says, "We greatly commending and graciously accepting of their desires for the furtherance of so noble a work," and this is the Jamestown Company, "which may by the providence of Almighty God hereafter tend to the glory of His divine majesty in propagating Christian religion to such people," the Indians, "as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and may in time bring the infidels and savages living in those parts to human civility and to a settled and quiet government. Do by our letters patent authorize you to go and make conquest in North America." So right here is this idea of the doctrine of discovery, that wherever Europeans came upon infidels and savage peoples, their king or queen could give them permission to conquer that land. And so the doctrine is grounded on this racist assumption that people who aren't up to the level of civilization of Europe don't have the same rights as Europeans. This idea and this principle of the doctrine was accepted in the most famous case in all of English-speaking law on the doctrine, Johnson v. McIntosh, decided in 1823. Our Chief Justice Marshall was confronted with the case of whether Indians had a right to own title to land. And if they had that right of title to land, then they could sell the land to whomsoever they pleased, or they could refuse to sell it to whomsoever they please. And Marshall's response to the idea that Indians had the same equal rights to property as white people was that under the Doctrine of Discovery, Europeans recognize no property rights in indigenous peoples. On the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe were eager to appropriate to themselves so much of it as they could respectively acquire. Its vast extent offered an ample field to the ambition and enterprise of all. And look at this next line. And the character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. In other words, that's the doctrine. Marshall tells you the reason for the doctrine. As they were all in pursuit of the same object, however, was necessary in order to avoid conflicting settlements and consequent war to agree upon a principle. And that principle was the doctrine. Discovery gave title to the government by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. Now we know that's a United States opinion, and I know Canadians' opinions of the US is that we're a very racist society, so what would you expect? Well, here's what you expect. Johnson v. McIntosh has been cited at least 44 times by Canadian courts. In other words, your law is based on doctrine. All of your foundational cases on Aboriginal title cite Johnson or build upon Johnson's recognition of the Doctrine of Discovery. In fact, Johnson v. McIntosh is followed not only by the Canadian Supreme Court, it's followed by Australia's highest court, it's followed by New Zealand's highest court, it's followed by South Africa's highest court, it's followed even by Belize, little tiny Belize, because they follow the English common law system and they use the doctrine to deny Aboriginal title and rights to Mayan people who've been on that land for 10,000 years. So this is the complex of ideas that I focus on in my book, this complex of ideas that people are non-Christian and don't adopt Western modes of civilization, have no rights to property or unequal rights. In fact, your courts embellished upon the doctrine in a number of cases. In the case of Silly Boy, 1929, I love this clause. In accepting the Doctrine of Discovery as the reason for denying the validity of treaties between the Mi'kmaq and Canada, the court said the Indians were never regarded as an independent power. A civilized nation first discovering a country of uncivilized people or savages, there's the S word again, held such country as its own until such time as by treaty it was transferred to some other civilized nation. The savages' rights of sovereignty, even of ownership, were not recognized. Nova Scotia passed to Great Britain not by gift or purchase or even by conquest of the Indians, but by treaty with France, which had acquired it by prior to discovery an ancient possession. And the Indians passed with it, like the rose bushes and trees. They're part of like the realty. Okay, your problem now, oh damn, we've got to deal with the Indians, thanks. Nah, they go with the real estate. That's how Canadian law regarded Indigenous peoples. As just essentially entities with no rights, just something that went along with the land and the country, the sovereign, had to deal with it. In fact, in a case before your Supreme Court right now that holds tremendous implications, this case could basically extinguish the majority of Aboriginal title throughout British Columbia. Because the BC Court of Appeals held that under the Doctrine of Discovery and Canadian law and English common law, you only have Aboriginal title to basically postage stamps. They literally said in this opinion that if Indians are fishing at a lake, they have to identify the stone from which they fished on prior to contact in order to secure their rights under the Doctrine of Discovery. The basic concepts underlying claims of Aboriginal title and Aboriginal rights are straightforward. See, this is normal for Canada. You don't understand that this is what the grounding assumption is. This is how your courts begin their analysis of Indigenous people's property rights, with the Doctrine of Discovery. It's foundational. It's constitutive of what Canada is. That's why I say without the doctrine, Canada, as you know it, would not exist. First Nations occupied the land that became Canada long before the arrival of Europeans. Europeans explorers considered that by virtue of the principle of discovery, they were at liberty to claim territory in North America on behalf of their sovereigns. Guerin v. the Queen. Look what they say next. While it is difficult to rationalize that view from a modern perspective, in other words, it's crazy. We admit it, it's really dumb. Nobody would say such a thing today. But nonetheless, the history is clear, and that's the position we adopt. While British policy toward the native population was based on respect for their right to occupy their traditional lands, there was from the outset never any doubt that sovereignty and legislative power, and indeed the underlying titles of such lands, vested in the Crown. See Johnson v. McIntosh. Without Johnson v. McIntosh, I don't know where you folks would be. It's the foundation of your law. Where did this complex of ideas come from? Does it have any correspondence to reality and what we see in nature? Well, that's what I tried to figure out in my book. I wanted to find out where Western civilization got this idea that indigenous peoples were savages. And because they were savages, they had no rights. And I knew if I went back to George Washington and the founders, I'd find it there. The founders of our country all talked about the Doctrine of Discovery, and all talked about the fact it was based on the fact that Indians were savages. And then I went back to Columbus and the European explorers, and they all used the Doctrine of Discovery. And then I went farther back, and what I discovered, and as I outlined in my book, is that the Crusades to the Holy Lands were fought under the theory that infidels, savages, and heathens didn't have any rights that Christians had to respect. I thought, wow, I've gone really far back. Maybe I can go farther back. I went back to Charlemagne and his wars of conquest against the Germanic tribes of Europe. He used the argument that savage, infidel, tribal peoples have no property rights. Then I went back to the Romans, and I found they used the idea too. And then I went back to where I couldn't go back anymore, the very beginnings of Western civilization, the Greeks. And I found that's where it started, that the Greeks invented the Doctrine of Discovery. And my argument is that the doctrine is so interbred into the very foundations of Western civilization that Western civilization can't exist without it. It defines who you are. It defines who you are, what you will be. The Greeks, in fact, were the first great colonizers of the Mediterranean. And the Greeks felt that any time they colonized an area that was inhabited by barbarians. You know what a barbarian is? Barbaros in Greek. A babbler. For the Greeks, if you couldn't speak Greek, you couldn't think rationally. You didn't have any morality. Therefore, you had no rights. So for the Greeks, when they came in and colonized, they weren't interested in converting barbarians, savages, and infidel tribal peoples of the Mediterranean to the Greek civilization, because they were simply incapable of achieving that high of a standard. And so the history we have of Greek colonization from about 800 BC through Alexander the Great was extermination. The Greeks would land on a coastal area, push the tribal people off who would go into the mountains, and then when you read the literature, what's amazing is 2 or 3 centuries later, the Greeks are saying, oh, well, all the savages live in the mountains, because we know that's where primitive people live, having forgotten that their ancestors had forced them off the land because they lacked civilization. In fact, how many people here have read Homer? Have read either the Iliad or the Odyssey? Everybody's read Homer. You could have got through high school. Do you realize that up until about 50 years ago, I can make this statement with absolute certainty? Every single educated person in Western civilization read Homer. That's what the canon is. My English teacher said after Homer, everything's plagiarism, right? Do you understand what that means? That every single educated person in Western civilization has absorbed the myths, the tales, the stories of Homer. And it's in Homer that we first encounter the idea that savage peoples have no rights. How many people know how many eyes the Cyclops have? In other words, you all know Homer's story. In fact, you all know what I call in my book, the language of savagery that Homer invents. And he doesn't invent it because what he's doing is drawing on 2,000 or 3,000 years of Greek tribal traditions. And he's putting those myths together in this great tale of the Trojan War. And he's a singing bard. And around 750, one of the members of the Guild of Homers, the Homeridae. See, the Homeridae had the right to control these sacred stories. And they memorized all 12 books of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And just at about the time that the Greeks are being reintroduced to writing by trading with the Phoenicians, somebody said, we ought to sit that Homer guy down. And he ought to recite the Iliad and the Odyssey, and all you folks ought to write it down. And that's how the West's first bestsellers were born. That's how they were produced. By 500 BC, in fact, we know that Athens was having contests for rhapsodes. Rhapsody, the rhapsodes. A rhapsode was somebody who could recite all 12 books of the Iliad and all 12 books of the Odyssey by heart. And those who did it most correctly would win a prize. So my point is, you can begin to understand this stuff is being drilled into the minds of elites, of the educated, at a very early age. And what do you find in Homer? What you find is a description of the island of the Cyclops, which most historians think was Sicily. Interestingly, at the time that the Iliad and Odyssey were put down in writing in 750, guess what? The Greeks were colonizing Sicily. This is like their Wild West tales. And what would the heroic adventurer discover when he went to Sicily? We sailed hence, always in much distress, till we came to the land of the lawless and inhuman Cyclops. And if you read this, it reads just like Columbus's description of the Arawaks. It reads just like Captain Cook's description of the Australians. It reads just like Vancouver's description of the Indians of British Columbia. In fact, they were all plagiarizing, because Homer establishes the categories of savagery for the next 3,000 years. How do we know they're a savage? They neither plant nor plow. They trust in providence. Sound familiar, First Nations folks? They live on wheat, barley, grapes that grow wild without any kind of tillage. Their wild grapes yield them wine as the sun and rain may grow them. They have no laws or assemblies. Do you realize that this idea that tribal indigenous peoples are lawless goes back 3,000 years? And my point is that it's so inbred in Western civilization that you can never extricate it. It's part of the fabric of your culture. It's who you are. It's everything you know about yourself and the rest of the world. They live in caves on the tops of mountains. Well, because we chase them there. Each is lord and master in his family. They take no account of their neighbors. Aristotle, how many people have read Aristotle? How many people have heard of Aristotle? Pretty important philosopher, right? Father of Western philosophy. Well, his problem was he had to come up with a theory of the perfect republic. And the problem is that for him, the perfect republic was 4th century imperial Athens, in which 3/5 of the people were slaves, and those who weren't slaves, 1/2 of those were women who couldn't vote or participate in the assembly. So how do you justify that? Most of our ideas of Western femininity and domesticity come from the Greeks. The idea that women stay in the house, their domain is the home, they have no right to engage in politics, that all comes from the Greeks. And as for slaves, how do you justify slavery? Aristotle invented natural law, right? How do you justify slavery under natural law? Well, you look at the fact that some people are slaves by nature, and we do them a favor by enslaving them. And who are slaves by nature? All barbarians. Barbarians had no rights. They had no rights to property, to bodily security, to anything. Wherefore the poets say, and there he's actually quoting Euripides, in Euripides' great play Iphigenia, where Iphigenia says she gives up herself, allows herself to be sacrificed because she says we can't have barbarians enslaving Greeks. Hellenes should rule over barbarians, as if they thought the barbarian and the slave were by nature one. Wherefore Hellenes do not like to call Hellenes slaves, but confine the term to barbarians. And using this language, they really mean the natural slave. So if you weren't Greek, you needed to be enslaved. You had no rights. This is the exact same argument used in the famous debates at Valladolid in 16th century Spain, where the king asked Sepulveda and Las Casas to justify my rule in the Indies. And Sepulveda, representing the royalist position, and the conquistadors argues, Aristotle. I don't need anybody's authority other than Aristotle. The Indians are natural slaves. This was the dominant theory justifying Western enslavement of non-Western peoples for over 1,700 years. How many people know where the University of Georgia is? In Athens, Georgia. Anybody know anything about Georgia's pre-Civil War history? They were a slave society. The reason they chose Athens was because of Aristotle. Aristotle had academically and intellectually justified slavery. And so they wanted their first university to be modeled after Athens. Now the Romans and if you know anything about the Romans, if you go over to Greece and you see all these headless statues, do you ever wonder why that was? Because the Romans would cut them off and take the heads back. You could always do the bodies, but the Greeks were so fine in capturing the essence of the human spirit through the face, they cut those heads off. And in fact, Julius Caesar, Cicero, were all taught by Greek tutors. It was a mark of distinction to be taught by a Greek slave. When Rome went over and conquered Greece, they would enslave the intellectuals and bring them back and make them tutors to their sons. And in fact, Caesar's Gallic Wars was originally written in Greek and then translated into Latin because a mark of distinction for a high-born Roman was that you could speak Greek. So they emulated everything the Greeks did, and they emulated their law, which said that barbarians had no rights. They had to be brought into the eternal empire for their own good. If you ever see that Russell Crowe movie, the Gladiator, that opening scene where the German tribes are sitting there going crazy and the pontiff rolls the dice, that's the Roman high priest. You get 3 chances. You get 3 chances to accede to the sovereignty of the Roman emperor, and if not, the pontiff rolls the dice, and if the auguries are auspicious, then you're authorized to go and conquer them, which means the Roman priest is saying there's about 200 of them and 800 of us, go for it. Anybody read Caesar's Gallic Wars? Ilia jacta est. Any Latin scholars here? Ilia jacta est.
Cast the die.
The die is cast. That's what he's referring to. We're going to go slaughter those barbarians. I'm going to go take over the Roman Senate. So the Romans take these Greek ideas that barbarians have no rights and expand their empire by conquering all the tribes of Western and Central Europe. In fact, my book shows that Western civilization has been at war with tribalism for 3,000 years continuously. It has never stopped. For 3,000 years, it's a way of life in the West. And all you got to do is walk through Rome today. This is Constantine's Arch. It's between the Forum and the Colosseum. And if you go up there, what you'll see are depictions of Roman soldiers leading savage peoples, roughly dressed, bearded, long hair, all the stereotypes of a savage, not being as civilized as Romans, are captured on that monument dedicated to the Emperor Constantine's conquest of barbarian peoples. Those great columns in the middle of Rome, if you go up to them, Trajan's column, Marcus Aurelius' column, they're basically depictions of Roman conquest of barbarian savage peoples. They show the Romans building bridges, bringing civilization, cutting off the heads of those who oppose them, putting the barbarian women and children into slavery. It's just a big advertisement. You didn't have newspapers in those days, so the emperor had to let somebody know about his genocide. That's what you did. You put it up on a big pole in the middle of Rome. Cicero, again, the perpetuator of the natural law tradition. It was Cicero who translates Aristotle into Latin, the greatest rhetorical scholar of the Roman classical period. When he was asked, why does Rome go to these foreign lands with people that have really not picked a fight with them and they don't even have weapons of mass destruction and invade them? Sound familiar? And what he says is, they were wild, savage, and warlike. Tribes which no one who has ever lived would not wish to see crushed and subdued. You do it for the hell of it. You do it because you're benefiting civilization by wiping these people out. Cicero was revered throughout the Middle Ages, the most influential Roman philosopher of the Middle Ages. In fact, my book recounts Western civilization's continuous wars against the savage using this racist language of cultural and religious inferiority. Charlemagne's wars against the tribes of Europe, the Christian Crusades, the Teutonic Knights. After they were kicked out of the middle, the Teutonic Knights, the Knight Templars, those great crusading orders, after they were evicted from the Middle East, they go settle in Germany and wipe out the pagan Lithuanians and the Wends for their failure to comport with Christian standards of civilization. The Papal Bull, how many people here are Irish? You know what Beyond the Pale was? So William the Conqueror gets a Papal Bull to invade the wild Irish because they had fallen away from the true Christianity and reverted back to their tribal customs. And beyond the Pale was anything south of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland had been successfully colonized by the Queen. They were Protestant. But beyond the Pale was where the wild Irish who were Catholics, and that division continues today. In other words, these aren't just historical, interesting facts I'm giving you. That these principles and these rules have been perpetuated by Western civilization for 3,000 years have contemporary effect, just like they do here in British Columbia. The Spanish Reconquista from the Moors was fought using this language of savagery. The Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews. If you read any of the 14th, 15th, and 16th century tracts on anti-Semitic church campaigns against the Jews, they continually use this idea that the Jews are in league with the devil. They make union through the Kabbalah with natural forces, that they're out there in the woods. They use the same language of savagery to justify those actions. And of course, the entire papal donation of Africa in 1450 by Romanus Pontifex. The Pope said, bring the infidels and savages to a Christian religion. We therefore allow you not only to conquer them, but because they run away when you conquer them and you can't Christianize them, you can enslave them for your own good, citing Aristotle's theory of natural slavery. And of course, the papal division of the world between Spain and Portugal, giving Spain most of what Columbus had discovered, was based on a papal bull which cited the language of savagery and the backward nature of the Indians as described by Columbus. This idea then gets picked up as well by the English crown even after the Reformation. So the papacy asserts this idea that it can designate Christian princes to go and conquer, colonize, and convert savage infidel lands. Then England breaks away, and the King of England now becomes head of the English church. And the English crown assumes the same rights as the papacy to grant lands to their subjects when those lands are discovered and they're occupied by non-Christian peoples.